meaning uncover or reveal. And we have since come to use the term to mean complete and final destruction or the end times. And I think both are actually ways that we can define this particular moment in history for the church as we know it here and now. What has been revealed in this time is that we cannot simply zoom the old ways of worship and sacrament. We must reinvent and take advantage of the new platforms of communication available to us. This takes new creativity, a new imagination. This will take us crossing over into a new way of church in the world. Gloria Anzaldúa tells us that we must remember, as in re-member, ourselves as an act of gathering our dismembered stories, our dismembered cultures, our dismembered bodies, and our dismembered traditions so that we can create something new. I was thinking about that. Social distancing, physically distancing has dismembered us from one another. And it is time for us to start to think about what does it mean to remember and regather again. As we prepare for the post-pandemic church, we must pause and consider what is essential as we sit in the liminal space. Anzaldúa reminds us that this journey requires a crossing into something new. And the non-essentials that are being revealed to us now, we must consider what we will leave behind and what we actually need to take with us, what is essential to take with us in the post-COVID-19 future. To cross into the new space, something in us or of us must die before something else can be born. COVID-19 and the subsequent shelter-in-place mandate has forced the church to more urgently address the shifting ideologies in our missiological methods, our theological understanding of what it means to be church, and our prophetic call of the church to come. I offer two things for you to consider towards this post-COVID-19 ecclesiology. One, are generational shifts, and two, the practices of resilience. As church planters, you know that even before COVID-19, we were in need of crossing into a new church identity because of the generational shifts. As boomers and Gen Xers prepare the church for millennials and Gen Zs, I would ask my class of future pastors and faith leaders, what must be done in this generational tipping point? We already recognize that for the sake of the continuation of the church, things cannot stay the same. On a practical level, churches have had to make adjustments. Church leaders have been forced to be kind of televangelists of sorts, having to figure out how to transmit fellowship and community, worship and divine presence over technology that feels distant and disembodied. Churches have wrestled with the best ways to pass the peace, unify the choir, and serve the Eucharist. I attend a mostly African-American church, and I noticed that the pastor switched his call and response from turn to your neighbor and say to chat someone amen. It's an adjustment for sure. Churches have Zoomed and YouTubed and Facebook Live their way into people's homes. Churches have had to consider how to make these online services accessible for those without internet access and for older members who may not be able to navigate the platforms as easily. So while these practical adjustments have forced church leaders to examine in an urgent way what is essential to the life of the church, we also need to think about the elements. Are the elements that we have enough to still transmit the same thing we want to do live in person as we do over Zoom or whatever online platform? Let's say the Eucharist, for example. Are the elements broken and shared the source, or can we just use coffee and crackers at home and still have the same kind of community over communion? And whatever we decide is essential now, will those essential things be the same essential things after the crisis has subsided? Said differently, what matters to the church, and does the church really matter? Millennials and Gen Zs have been asking these questions, but Shelter in Place has brought those questions to the forefront in a more immediate way. In religious sociology, millennials and Gen Zs have been marked as the nones and dones, N-O-N-E-S and D-O-N-E-S. Either they weren't religious at all or they're done with religion. But does that mean that they aren't spiritual? In this time of physical distancing, we long for something greater to meet the fragility of our humanity. What needs to be put to death in church, and what is our opportunity for rebirth and resurrection? Indeed, we are in an apocalyptic moment. Millennials and even more so Gen Zs care about what we do on a social justice level. How are we as the church addressing the needs to our vulnerable neighbors who do not have masks, or those who have to work and are exposed to the virus, or those who are incarcerated or in close proximity, or those who do not have homes during shelter in place? Kaiser Health News just reported the exacerbated crisis that many Black and brown neighborhoods face as the economic and racial disparities impact their exposure and the disproportionately high death rates. We, the church, have always been called to serve the poor and the oppressed and the vulnerable. But today the crisis calls for even greater effort on our part, and maybe even at our own cost. What is being revealed in this moment? This leads me to the theological concerns of what it means to be church in this time in history. The irony of physically distancing to save lives is that now more than ever, we need physical presence. I have never savored the idea of a hug as much as I have at this point. I'm not a big hugger, but right now I really miss hugging people. But theologically, physicality is the very nature of the incarnation, and maybe that's why we long for that. Who is Jesus when not incarnational? And who is the church without being that incarnational presence today? In this time of physical distancing, does our definition of incarnation need to change? Can the incarnation be zoomed? There are many other theological questions in this moment, but our need to physically distance is an essential question for a community that has long depended on gathering with one another for identity and purpose and encouragement. This leads to the question of what is the prophetic call of the church in this moment? I've struggled as I ask my students what their vocational call is right now, because when they started their Masters of Divinity programs, it was a completely different church than what they will graduate into. In fact, we don't know what we will look like, much less the church, after this crisis has subsided. Sheltering in place has forced many of us to face our core beings in such a profound and potentially painful way, because many of our coping or covering up mechanisms and devices are no longer available. I can say for myself, I'm a pretty busy person. And now that I don't have to commute as much, and now that I don't travel as much, I've had to face things in my own personal life that I didn't even realize I was avoiding. It has caused me to think about what is essential in my life and what is non-essential. I think this is true also for the church at large. We can no longer hide behind certain ways that we have always done things. We are now looking at ourselves asking what is essential. This question strips away any pretense, any superfluous action, any empty gesture, or thinly worn theology. The essentialized church is one that can speak to the present and imagine the future. What do we need to do, and what do we need to jettison out of our budgets in order to meet the needs of the people who long for belonging and dignity? My gut instinct is that the prophetic church today will look a lot like our immigrant churches or our ethnic specific churches. These are churches that understand resilience. These are churches with grit. Immigrant churches have had to survive as individuals and as a community at large. They understand how to appropriate resources wisely, how to make a lot with very little, how to survive crisis, and most importantly, how to depend on one another as if their lives depended on it, because they do. Immigrant churches have often come up with what I would call the practices of resilience. These are methods in which they have survived the storms. Many of our ancestors knew hardships and they knew resilience. They were innovators and resistors and creators and organizers. They lived as a village, whether it was in the Pacific Islands or on the concrete pavements of Toronto. They held on to each other as if their lives depended on it, because they did. They were thankful for what they had and mindful to share with those in need. Personally, I grew up in a Filipino United Methodist Church that's now 52 years old. So generations have come and gone through that same church. And it is in that church that my theology was shaped. After service, we always had potluck, and we shared what we had with one another and celebrated in the abundance of the collective group. We remembered and treated one another as family. Everyone was an auntie or uncle or cousin to me in church. We remembered as Filipinos living in an individualistic American land. We connected to each other in much more intimate ways than a handshake. We greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek. We were not socially distant. We were socially embedded with one another. Practices of resilience look different to different communities depending on their needs. Counterintuitively, these practices are based on a posture of abundance and not scarcity. Even if resources are scarce, a posture of abundance allows us to trust each other when we give ourselves wholly. Others will give back what we need as well. It is this trust that we can share that there is enough to go around. Practices of resilience can look like potlucks, where we hold each other in community, food banks, where we meet immediate needs, economic lending structures, where we support each other financially, and house sharing, where we rethink housing in urban and dense communities. I grew up with distant relatives and international students living in our home for months or years at a time. Our house was never just for us. What if we looked at the church as something so fluid, we shared our personal resources in a sacrificial way? Practices of resilience takes a shared commitment to one another to live a life in what Father Greg Boyle has called radical kinship. My beloved community, this is our task today. You have the opportunity to remember us as communities of faith once again. Remind us that we can be socially embedded beings. Remind us that to be the beloved community. We have a chance to cross this liminal space into a world where we can, with permission, hug each other once again. We are positioned in this liminal space of a bridge between the world we once knew and the post-pandemic world to come. We need you. We need to hear your stories. We need to hear your pain. We need to hear your hope. We will look to you for comfort and maybe even guidance in a world unfamiliar to us. We must leave behind what is non-essential and use our creative imaginations to shape a church that is essential to the present moment of the future. Lastly, to look back at the church, the early church, the Greek word we use to mean church is ecclesia. It was an assembly gathering of people. Our at the school where I teach, the New Testament professor Sharon Jacobs informed me that in Greco-Roman times, ecclesia was tied to citizenship. But when they used it to mean church, the meaning extended to women and slaves, people not counted as full citizens. The imagination of what it meant to gather as a church was expanded beyond the social constructs to include more people and extend inclusion to people in the margins. Ecclesia meant more than just citizenship of who was in and who was out. It meant everybody. In our apocalyptic moment for the church, in the remembrance of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and in the urgent and imminent questions of who we are as a church in this moment in history, we will need to have the same kind of ecclesial imagination. We cannot be bound by the constructs or circumstances. We must allow ourselves to let go of what we once knew, grieve those losses, and breathe in hope, and begin to imagine crossing over into the new days to come. Thank you.